Welcome, Solid Source. It's Derek Varnadoe, Vice President of Broker Services, and we are reviewing the Georgia Association of Realtors, GAR's, Purchase and Sale Agreement. Together, we're going to take a look at the purpose of the GAR Purchase and Sale Agreement. We're going to talk about how to access contract forms, and we're going to draft an agreement together. It's important to note that the GAR Purchase and Sale Agreement, it isn't easy to use. It's a general agreement that is designed to meet the needs of most real estate transactions through customization. For example, through adding exhibits and special stipulations. It's a fill-in-the-blank agreement with base language offering remedy for common issues that may arise from contract to close, for example, earnest money and damage to the property. Solutions to common issues that have risen over the years are baked into the purchase and sale agreement. And one of the great things about the GAR agreement is that all of the blanks to be completed that we're going to review today are on pages 1, 7, and 8. So it's an 8-page agreement, and the blanks to be completed are on pages 1, 7, and 8. Now, who has access to the GAR contract form? So if you're an active board member with Solid Source Realty, you will have access to the GAR forms. The permission to use the GAR forms, the price to use the GAR forms is already baked into the annual fee that you pay your local Board of Realtors. Now, if you're a non-board member with Solid Source Realty Georgia, you can purchase a license to use the GAR forms by visiting forms.garealtor.com. Now, you won't have a NERDS number, but you will receive a Forms Purchase ID number. This number can be entered into Docs Plus with an FMLS Remind or the transaction desk if you're using Georgia MLS that will allow you to retrieve those forms. So, which leads me into my next question, which is where can I access the GAR forms? FMLS or Georgia MLS? FMLS is much more user-friendly to most of us, so I do recommend accessing those through FMLS. Doesn't have to be an FMLS property to use Docs Plus. And if you prefer Georgia MLS, it is going to be available to you in the transaction desk. Now, just a quick tip here, how to access forms in FMLS. When you're on the FMLS homepage, under Products, you're going to see Remind. Now, when you select Remind, the next step is you're going to click on this waffle icon here, this grid-looking icon right here. You're going to be able to click on that, and that's going to take you to this next screen here, and you'll be able to select Docs Plus. Now, you can create a new transaction. You can go in and add documents to a transaction you've already started. But I do want to point out, you have two different ways to pull in forms. You can select Forms and a la carte, choose the form that you are looking for, or you can go to Packages. Now, what we've already done for you is we have created a package for common real estate transactions for both GAR and RE, just to make everything a little bit simpler for you. For example, within the GAR Contract Package, you're going to notice we've got the affiliated business disclosure, the purchase and sale agreement, instructions to closing attorney, different types of financing from conventional, FHA, VA, cash. Now, we understand that all of these forms won't be used in the same transaction, but you can simply choose the forms that are applicable and just makes things that much faster for you when you're creating your offer. Now, a couple of tips prior to making an offer. Look at a CMA, which is a comparable market analysis. Look at what properties have sold for in that community, in that area, that are most similar to the property that the buyer is looking to make an offer for. Take a look at active listings, pending listings. The more data we can provide to the buyer, the more we're educating them, and they can make a more educated offer. Perhaps all of the properties in that area are selling very quickly, and perhaps they're selling for 100% of the list price or more. That's great information for a buyer to have, whether we're in a seller's market or a buyer's market. Just helps them make a more informed offer. And of course, talk about brokerage relationships. the difference between a customer and a client. Remember, a client relationship here in Georgia, because of Beretta, is only formed through the signing of a written brokerage agreement. If there's not a written brokerage agreement, instant example, buyer brokerage agreement, that individual or individuals are merely customers. Nothing wrong with it, but for customers, we're only allowed to perform ministerial tasks. And I found over the years that most buyers do want guidance. They do want our expertise. So a client relationship is what a lot of buyers are going to be looking for. And that's a conversation that needs to be had prior to making the offer so that our offer is accurate. And if you're looking for a great explanation of agency for yourself or to give to your clients or your prospective clients, GAR's ABCs of Agency is wonderful. Absolutely love it. It's GAR CB01, and it's called Understanding Real Estate Brokerage Relationships in Georgia. So if everyone's ready, let's go ahead and dive in and build an offer. We are now in FMLS Remine Docs Plus, and I have titled this transaction offer FSBO, for sale by owner, and I'm going to select form. And again, I have the option to pull in individual forms or select from a package that has already been created for me just to make things a little bit faster. So I am using the GAR contracts today. GAR contracts are definitely worth the investment. If you are not a board member, they're definitely worth the investment. They're revised every single year based on advice and feedback from brokers and attorneys across the state of Georgia. Case law, they do more for protecting real estate licensees and buyers and sellers than any other contract in the state of Georgia. It's definitely the leading contract for agents here in Georgia. So I'm going to select GAR Contract Package and give that just a moment to load. And I'm simply going to unselect the items that I don't need today. And I do want the purchase and sale agreement. It's a conventional loan that the buyer is seeking to purchase the property. So I know that I will also need the affiliated business arrangement disclosure. Anytime it's a residential deal and there's financing involved, the affiliated business disclosure, we do want to present that to the party we are working with and ask that they sign off on it. They're not required to use any of the service providers on that form, but it is a disclosure that we're required to make as a result of RESPA. RESPA stands for Real Estate Standards and Procedures Act. So now that I've selected the forms I need, you're going to notice that they show up here under My Selections. So I'm going to click Next. That is going to pull the forms into our transaction today. And I'm going to start with the purchase and sale agreement. And here in Docs Plus, these are what we call smart forms. So again, just makes our lives a little bit easier. And I'm going to begin with the offer date. Now the offer date is really just a reference point. It's typically the day that we create the offer and the same day that the buyer signs it. So I'm going to select that. And I'm going to go ahead and select from my calendar the date. So today just so happens to be November the 29th. Going to select that and it's going to pull that in. Now, the GAR purchase and sale agreement again has blanks to be completed on pages 1, 7, and 8. Now, under key terms and conditions in section A, it's going to give us two different ways to identify the property. One is the commonly known mailing address, and secondly, the legal description. The mailing address alone is not enough. It's not enough to meet the requirements set forth by the Georgia Real Estate Commission. And it's simply not enough to unmistakably identify the property. We want to identify the property that we are making an offer on without a doubt. So the GAR contract solution is, yes, we're setting forth the mailing address, but we're also setting forth the legal description or a reference point. We're referencing a place where a party could find a complete legal description of the property, such as the deed book and the page number. So let's start with our address. Now I'm going to select manually enter address. Now again, this is a for sale by owner transaction. In our example today, if this was an FMLS property, we could enter in the FMLS number and it's going to populate as many of these items as it can find through the tax records. .207 New Home Way, and our property will be in Alpharetta, which is Fulton County. Now in our example today, we're going to have the deed book and the page number. Deed book and page number is pretty easy to find through Realist tax records. If you're on Realist, there's going to be a section that's going to be called Last Market and Sales History. That will typically have reference to the most recent deed book and page number. Makes it so easy when we're making an offer. Now, if we're using Weissman as the closing attorney, our partnership with them, Sherry Gill, she's our solid source liaison. She is amazing. She's always happy to pull a copy of the most recent deed and email that over to you, and you could actually include that as an attachment to the offer. But if you're making an offer really quickly, deed book and page number usually is going to be really easy to find right there in the tax records. So I'm going to say I'm done. Now notice it populates the information here. Now if I happen to have the tax parcel ID number, I could go ahead and enter it in. In the example today, I'm not going to have that. If you had that from the tax records, go ahead and paste that in, as well as the MLS number. So our mailing address is in A. Now in B, I already know that I happen to have the deed book and the page number. So I'm going to go ahead and select 3, and it's going to populate that here. I do want to take just a moment to talk about option 4. This is not very common to use section 4, but if we are going to use this section here, we would want to at least be able to include the plat book and the page number. If we just simply referenced 1 or 2 fields here in this section, it would not really be enough to accurately describe the property. So we would want to include in as much information as we could in section 4, including the plat book and page number if we're going to use that section. But most commonly 3 and 1 if it's a condominium. If it's a condominium, there is an exhibit that Gar has. It's referenced right here. It's F204. We would also want to make sure that is attached. It discloses the fact that the condo is subject to the community rules and regulations, and what the buyer is purchasing is actually an air lot and not your standard fee simple property. All right, so we're looking pretty good here. We've got the property identified by mailing address and a reference point where a party could find the legal description, and we're going to move on to our offer price. So in our example today, our buyer is going to offer $375,000. They are asking for $5,000 in seller's closing costs. Always a good idea to check with the lender. Most lenders are going to have caps on how much they will allow a seller to contribute toward a buyer's purchase. Maybe it's 3, maybe it's 3.5%. Maybe we also want to take a look when we pull our CMA and see the other properties that have closed that are similar to ours or in that neighborhood. What did the seller contribute? You can actually see that in FMLS when you look at those comps. You can see what other sellers have paid in closing costs. That may help guide a buyer as well when making their offer. So this is a conventional loan, and it can close in around 45 days. So what we're going to do here is we're going to move right into early January. Now, Mondays and Fridays are days we want to avoid if we can when it comes to closing days, because those days are typically going to be busier. So I'm going to schedule this closing to January the 6th, which is right in the middle of the week. We are going to allow possession to be granted at closing. A buyer moving in early or a seller staying in a property after closing is never recommended. If that is the case, we would just want to make sure that we attach a temporary occupancy agreement for that applicable party to the agreement. It's going to offer as much protection as we can in the event that a seller is going to stay or a buyer is going to move in early. I will say that in most cases, I would recommend pushing the closing date back to avoid a temporary occupancy agreement, if at all possible, as a solution. All right, so in Section 5, earnest money, We're going to name Solid Source Realty as the earnest money holder today. Now keep in mind, Solid Source Realty holds earnest money for both Solid Source Realty and Solid Source Realty Georgia. So if you happen to be a licensee with Solid Source Realty Georgia, such as myself, and you want for Solid Source to hold the earnest money, name Solid Source Realty as the holder, not Realty GA. Closing attorney is going to be Weissman, and it's going to be the Alpharetta office, so I'm going to go ahead and just specify Alpharetta. And the earnest money, the buyer is going to be remitting earnest money online at solidsourcem.com. Now this is not a check, it's definitely not cash, and it's not a wire, but it is an ACH transfer. So what I'm going to do in that case, I'm going to make use of Section C to specify. So I'm going to mirror the language that has already been set forth in B in C, but I'm going to edit it slightly. You'll see. Within 3 days, 2 to 3 days is pretty standard. Now, one of our goals when we create a contract is to make it simple enough that even a stranger to the agreement could understand it. So I'm making this very simple, very easy to understand. $5,000 earnest money within 3 days from the binding agreement date by ACH transfer, solidsourcem.com. Now let's take just a moment to talk about these other options here. B is perfectly fine. Maybe it is a buyer remitting earnest money to a holder by check. Certainly nothing wrong with that. Not every buyer is going to want to use the online system, perhaps with Solid Source or Weissman. If Weissman is the earnest money holder, they also have an ACH website. Theirs is weissmanem.com. You could simply select B, put the amount of earnest money and the number of days it's due. Section A. Never recommend A. This used to be more common years and years ago, but earnest money as of the offer date is usually not the way a buyer wants to go. If the offer is not accepted, buyers can easily become frustrated waiting to receive a return of their earnest money. So it's really more fair for a buyer to remit funds within a number of days after acceptance of the offer. Okay, so earnest money is looking good. Let's take a moment to talk about inspection and due diligence. Georgia is a buyer beware state. It's very common for a buyer to have a due diligence period, typically 7 to 12 days. In a seller's market, you're going to see the number of days less. In a buyer's market, you're going to see it pushed to a little bit more, like 14 days. But this needs to be an ample amount of time for a buyer to have their home inspection, their pest inspection, a survey if they're having a survey. They need to have enough time to look into the things that could be deal breakers for them. Also have time to try to negotiate if they would like to. Maybe they want to ask a seller to make repairs to the property. Well, there needs to be enough time to request those repairs and to receive an answer back from the seller. Because a buyer can terminate for any reason during due diligence. But once the due diligence period has expired, the buyer is buying the property as is. They don't have a right to simply just terminate for whatever reason anymore. In our example today, we're going to use 10 days. And of course, I will just throw in, if a buyer is going to have a shorter due diligence period, having a home inspector lined up, having all the professionals lined up in advance would be a really smart idea. Okay, so let's talk about Section B. Option payment for due diligence. This is not common in Georgia. This is not common, and I very rarely see it used, perhaps in a multiple offer situation. It could be something that could be appealing to a seller, because option money is money that is paid to the seller as of the offer date or within so many days. If that was going to be utilized, I would definitely recommend that it be within a number of days from acceptance. And it either can or cannot go toward the buyer's purchase of the property. I would definitely recommend that it shall be applied toward the purchase price of the property. Now, this is money that the buyer will not receive back unless the seller were to default. It's money paid by the buyer to the seller. They're not getting it back unless the seller were to default, which is pretty rare. And again, because Georgia's buyer beware and most buyers do have due diligence, it's so standard here, it's not often that this section be used. But again, in multiple offers, perhaps a buyer's asking for an unusually long due diligence period. Maybe they want 25 days for whatever reason here. Then it may make more sense to have non-refundable option money in that particular case. Okay, so we're not offering option money today, so I'm going to go ahead and take this off. I'm going to move down to lead-based paint. Now, the property was not built prior to 1978, but if it were, the EPA, the Environmental Protection Agency, would require that I present the buyer with a lead-based paint informational pamphlet and that I receive a lead-based paint exhibit already completed by the seller to present to the buyer for their review and their completion, and it would need to be attached to this offer. So a common mistake that I see with lead-based paint is that it's completed after an agreement has been formed. It needs to be completed by both parties no later than the offer date. It needs to be attached to the offer and completed by both parties. Now let's talk about brokerage relationships in this transaction. Now, we have a buyer brokerage agreement with our buyer, so we're going to select one here. We're representing the buyer as a client. Now the listing broker, there's not a listing broker, so I'm going to simply put not applicable here. The seller is a customer. So if we're working with a for sale by owner, GAR does have a form. It's called Authorization to Show Unlisted Property. This form helps to confirm that the seller is only a customer and also confirms the amount of commission that the seller is willing to pay at closing. So before we get to this stage, we would want the seller to sign off on an authorization to show unlisted property. So I'm putting NA because it is for sale by owner. There is no material relationship to disclose here, but if I, as the buyer's agent, were also a principal, this would be a great place to disclose that. If there was a material relationship that we had with the seller, perhaps it's a seller that we worked with in the past as a client or someone that maybe is a family member, this would be the perfect place to disclose that as well, right underneath material relationship disclosure. On page 7, we have Section 8 and Special Stipulations. So in Section 8, Exhibits and Addenda, we're going to reference any exhibits that we're going to have to our offer. So we know we have conventional loan exhibit. I'm going to go ahead and make that Exhibit A. Now keep in mind exhibits go in alphabetical order, A, B, C, and D, and amendments or counter offers go numerically, 1, 2, 3, 4. The conventional loan exhibit is the only exhibit that we have in our example today. Special stipulations. So we do have a special stipulation that does populate regarding earnest money, just to help you guys out, just in case Solid Source Realty Georgia had been named as the earnest money holder. This just helps to correct that because, again, if Solid Source is the desired holder, Solid Source Realty holds the funds for both companies. Let's talk a little bit about if there's a conflict. So exhibits do override any of the base language in the contract itself. Special stipulations trump everything. Special stipulations control over anything in the contract or on an exhibit. The only thing that's really going to override a special stipulation would be an amendment to the contract, should we do an amendment to remove a special stipulation or add one later on. Now, if a special stipulation is needed before we draft our own, the best advice I can give you is to take a look at the special stipulations that GAR already has in place. These have already been prepared by attorneys. So if we simply click anywhere in special stipulations, we have the opportunity to add a clause or to create new. So we're going to select add clause because there's two that we want to add today. One is for a home warranty and the other is for termite. So I'm going to select the Georgia Association of Realtor folder. And I'm going to search. I'm not sure at this moment which folder it's going to be in, but I definitely know that we are looking for a home warranty. So let's see every special stipulation that has the word warranty in it. Now right off the bat, I see seller to provide home warranty. Let's preview that. This happens to be exactly what I'm looking for. So I'm going to add clause. and this is going to place us into the contract. Now I can edit this. Perhaps I'm using Choice Home Warranty. And I have taken a look at their website, and I see that the $600 should cover. And I need to add one more, because I do want to add a special stipulation about a termite letter. So here we go. So we're back to add clause. I'm going to select Georgia Association of Realtors, and I'm going to type in the word termite. This might be what I'm looking for. It is, so I'm going to select add clause. Done. And it's going to pull that special stipulation in. Now, I'm going to go back and I'm going to number my special stipulations just to make it easy for me later to reference. There we go. And let's move on now to our final page, which is the signature page. So we've come a long way. We're almost there. Now the first half of the signature page is really for the parties, the buyers and the sellers, to sign. So I'm going to go ahead and include Jane Doe, who is my buyer. And notice that I'm not adding an address for her. I'm not adding a phone number or an email because we have a client relationship with Jane. So notice to us will be notice to Jane, which is why as soon as I receive anything, a counter offer back, a proposed amendment from the seller, I'm going to send that over to Jane as soon as I can. Now, there's no right or wrong here. I could include Jane's information, but it is oftentimes tempting when there is a real estate agent on the other side of the deal, if they can't get a hold of me right away, for them to want to reach out to Jane directly. And I don't want that. I want everything to go through me. And since I do have that client relationship especially, notice to us is notice to her. So I'm actually not going to include it. Now, if Jane were just a customer, I would absolutely need to include it, and I would do so. Now, under my information here, it's going to have name and license number. Very important. The Georgia Real Estate Commission does require that the license number for the agents and the brokerage firm be in every agreement. So it's got license number there. It's got phone number there. Let's say you want to change that to your cell phone number. Please go ahead and do so. Add email address. If you're a member of a board of realtors, you can certainly go ahead and add that there as well. And it already has auto-populated the firm license number 61704. Now, there is not a listing broker in this case, so that information can remain blank. Now, this is a for sale by owner. I do know the seller's name happens to be John Doe, so I'm going to go ahead and include that as well. And in a real world situation, I would want to go ahead and get John's contact information and include that here just to make things easy for him. My goal is to create an offer that John can easily accept. He can go ahead and sign it, send it back if he's good with the terms, and an offer he doesn't have to make a lot of changes with, especially knowing that there's not an agent on the other side for me to deal with, so I'm going to be doing a little bit more paperwork perhaps in this situation than normal. Now, if we ever have a situation where we're dealing with more than 2 buyers or sellers, Gar does have an additional signature page. We can select this option and go ahead and include that if we need to. And so there you have it. We have completed GAR's purchase and sale agreement offer, and we're at this point ready to go ahead and send it off to Jane for signature. So before I do that, and this is just a little tip for Docs Plus, I actually prefer to convert the document to a PDF. So I'm taking away the smart form function because I don't want anybody who is signing this form to make changes to it. I already have it set up exactly how Jane wanted me to. She's approved it. She's good with it. So I select PDF. It flattens it. And then I go ahead and send it out for signature. Thank you for watching. If you have any questions about preparing an offer, please know that your broker team is available. We're always happy to look at drafts of offers. You can email the draft to broker@solidsource.com. Have questions or concerns? Give us a call. The broker extension is 8015. So anytime you call the main number and you enter in extension 8015, you will have access to a team of brokers and attorneys on staff who are happy to answer any questions that you have. We appreciate you very much.